On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about some very common problems in mead making and how to overcome them. Mead making is relatively simple in practice, but every now and then life is going to throw you some curveballs, or you might throw yourself some curveballs. And so I thought it might be helpful to put together a short list of some of the most common problems we see in home mead making and how to fix them or at least salvage something from your mead. Number one, it stanks. There are three main smelly smells that you might get in a mead. There's a yeasty smell or bready smell, there's a sulfuric smell, and then there's, of course, vinegar. The yeasty smell is just a sign of young mead, and generally with some time, maybe some cold crashing and clearing, get as much of that yeast out of the mead as possible, and that should reduce some of that bready kind of off flavor. You can also throw in some fining agents to help precipitate out a bunch of the stuff that's suspended in there and help remove some of that flavor also. A yeasty, bready flavor should not persist in a finished mead. There are two different sulfur smells you might encounter in home brewing. There's sulfur dioxide, which smells like a burnt match, and there's hydrogen sulfide, which smells kind of farty or like rotten eggs. You're rarely going to encounter sulfur dioxide in a mead, so I'm not even going to talk about it here. It's just not really a thing that you're going to see in mead, but every now and then you might see in beer or braggots. Now, hydrogen sulfide, it's pretty common. And in my experience, it's usually common with apple juice ferments like a cider or sizer, but it can happen in mead just through poor nutrition. So that's why it's important to use a staggered nutrient schedule with higher ABV meads, so that way you avoid temperature spikes and you provide a consistent nutrition all the way through so your yeasts don't get overstressed. If you have hydrogen sulfide problems, stirring it with a copper rod or racking it through a copper racking cane or doing a gentle splash rack can help get rid of that smell. I have a whole video on fixing sulfur smells in your meads, wines, beer, ciders. I would recommend checking that out for more information. I'll put a link in the description. Now, the vinegar smell is a little bit more difficult to ascertain because to a lot of folks, a young, unbalanced mead will smell like vinegar because it's kind of sour. That's not necessarily going to indicate that your mead has turned into vinegar. Generally, if it has, you will find a mother in there, kind of a blob like a SCOBY, and that would be the thing that was converting your mead into vinegar. If that's the case, congratulations, you have a gallon of vinegar now. There's not really a way to salvage a brew that has turned into vinegar, in part because acetic acid, the acid in vinegar, when it combines with ethanol, can create a compound called ethyl acetate, which tastes and smells like nail polish remover and is very offensive. So if you have vinegar, use it up, enjoy it, give it away as gifts, turn it into hot sauce, whatever. But over time, over a long period of time, you can get kind of a nasty chemical out of it. There's no saving that mead. The best way to avoid your mead turning to vinegar is to use an airlock and proper sanitization practices and just minimize the amount of time your carboy or bucket is open to the open air, because the acetic acid bacteria is kind of everywhere. Number two, stalled fermentation. This is another issue typically brought on by poor mead nutrition, where the yeast doesn't have enough of the vitamins and minerals it needs to complete fermentation. Then your yeast gets choked up on the amount of alcohol it's generated combined with the residual sugars in there and just stops fermenting. There are some ways to attempt to mitigate this. One of the best ways is to gently rouse the lees. That's the stuff at the bottom of the carboy. Just use a sanitized rod and stir gently to bring that lees back up, and any healthy yeast will rejoin the fray, and you'll also be suspending some of the dead yeast in there so that the living yeast will have a little bit more nutrition that they can feast on because they're cannibals. And of course, you want to make sure that you keep an eye on temperature. You want your fermentation temperature to be within the range for your prescribed yeast. Typically, that's going to be somewhere between 68 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Still having a little bit of trouble or sluggish fermentation? You might add just a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 grams per gallon of Fermade O. Fermade O is a nutrient that is organic and natural, and anything left over will precipitate out just like your yeast will. So Fermade O is a somewhat riskless endeavor to try and kind of revive the yeast that are in there with some added nutrition. It's a little bit of a gamble, but I have had experiences where adding a little bit of Fermade O on a mead that's stuck at like 1.020, 1.030 helps kind of get it the rest of the way there. And lastly, if you're really having trouble rehydrating some yeast using a rehydration nutrient like GoFirm, then you would rouse your lees, pour that fresh yeast starter in, and hopefully it would take hold and finish out the rest of the way. A yeast that would be good for this would be something like EC1118, K1V1116, or even 71B, something that has a pretty high alcohol tolerance and is fairly aggressive, because you're gonna need that gusto to get things moving again. Number 3, my mead just won't clear up. Now, we drink first with our eyes, which is why we love a nice crystal clear mead, something that is really appealing and kind of mimics what you see commercially or in bars. It tells us that the product must be good. If you see something hazy or with an inch or two of fluff in the bottom of the bottle, obviously it might taste good, but it looks kind of gross and your friends and family may not want to drink it. And of course, it depends on the type of mead you're making, but some meads are just really difficult to clear up, like a Metafoam traditional. Things that I've found to be really effective are Dual Fine, which is a fining agent made of Kieselsaal and chitosan. It's a 2-part fining agent. Both are charged differently and you add them at separate times, and that can really help stuff clump and fall to the bottom. Sparkleoid is my choice for a fining agent. It's super cheap. It's a quick hot mix fining agent. You boil it in a little bit of water, dump it in, and it usually clears things in a few days. You can also try cold crashing. That's one of the simplest ways of clearing a mead. Just put it in the back of the fridge for a few days and let the temperature bring the yeast into hibernation, and then you can rack off of that. And generally that's gonna get a bunch of stuff out of suspension too. Lastly, a kind of long shot would be to use gelatin. Gelatin fining is pretty common in beer making, but you don't see it a lot in mead. Part of that is because gelatin has a tendency to strip tannin out, so you might have to readjust your tannin balance after using gelatin. But from what I've seen, using gelatin can be pretty effective. You use about a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half of gelatin. You put that in some water, let it bloom for a couple minutes, then you boil it, stir it up, and the gelatin will mix into the water, and then you pour that into the mead. The gelatin creates kind of a fine net inside of your mead, and so you might see it as some blobs that kind of form into kind of a canvas and then just settle to the bottom, pulling a bunch of junk with it. This can be, again, super helpful, and you can get it from your grocery store, but be advised that it will strip some of your tannin. Number 4, my stabilization didn't work. This can happen a lot of times due to the fact that stabilizers are not shelf stable, funny enough, and can kind of off-gas into the air as you store them. And so over time, about a year to a year and a half, your stabilizers can get less effective. So I like to mark mine the date I bought them and then replace them about a year later, just so I'm not working with outdated stabilizers. But even then, sometimes your dosage may be off a little bit, your pH might not be where you thought it was, and your stabilization can fail. So what do? Because you don't really want to stabilize it again, because that can lead to off flavors, and there are some people who are sensitive to stabilizers, and so going past the recommended parts per million can actually make some folks sick. It's rare, but it happens. The best thing to do at that point, if at all possible, is to get it into bottles and get it pasteurized. At least then it's done. It might not be what you wanted to make of it, but the problem is solved. Now, I don't typically recommend pasteurizing because, as we've seen across the internets, it can be incredibly dangerous when it goes wrong and creates a bottle bomb. But as a last resort, it's a thing you can do, and I've got a video on how you can do that using a sous vide immersion circulator. Now, if you still want it to be sweet, you can pivot and use a non-fermentable sweetener like erythritol. There will be some flavor and viscosity difference between that and using honey, but at least then you don't have to worry about re-fermentation because your yeast can't eat it. This typically works fairly well for meads that are off-dry to slightly sweet, but You really don't want to use erythritol for something that's going to be super sweet, because you can start to taste the kind of sugar alcohol-y mintiness, for lack of a better term, that erythritol can bring in higher dosages. Another thing you can do with a stabilized mead that didn't stabilize is you can blend it with something else. Maybe blend it with an unstabilized mead or 2 unstabilized meads, so that way you're diluting it down enough that you can be comfortable stabilizing it with potassium metabisulfite and potassium sorbate without creating an overage situation that would lead to tummy troubles or flavor contributions. Blending it can be a great way of diluting it back down to a safe level for stabilization and saving your mead so it doesn't go down the drain. Or you can just pivot entirely. Just feed it a bunch more honey, up the ABV to something crazy high, and just run with it as a new experimental batch that just went a different route than what you had planned. You can rebrew the other thing, but this is your new canvas, your new sandbox, something to play with that turned into a little bit of a happy little accident. You might find yourself surprised by the magic you might be able to create out of something you weren't planning, but just decided to go hog wild on. Number 5, my mead oxidized. This one is pretty easily identifiable. It usually starts by your mead starting to get darker and darker and browner from what you started with. You might have started with something that's kind of a nice straw yellow, and then a few months down the road, it's more of an amber brown, and then a year down the road, it's dark brown, if not looking like a stout or something. And as that color change happens, a flavor change also happens. It will start to taste kind of sour, and then it'll start to taste a little woody or papery until it kind of goes all the way off to like a wet cardboard, wet dog kind of flavor and aroma. And it's gross. I have had a really good example of very oxidized mead before, and it is nasty. You want to try and stop things before you get to that point, but oxidization is kind of a thing that once it starts, it keeps going without some intervention. So one of the things you can do is make sure you have plenty of parts per million of sulfites. Sulfites act as an antioxidant. There are calculators out there for how to determine those amounts, but typically you want to go with about a Campden tablet's worth per gallon in order to have enough parts per million to prevent oxidization. And that's a thing that you want to do the very first time you rack it. And generally, if you're one of the folks who likes to mitigate oxygen with sulfites, that's the thing you want to do the very first time you rack it. And then you want to add about half that much every subsequent time you rack it or when you bottle it. Now, I don't always do this, but I have pretty good oxygen management practices here in my studio. There are things you can try. There's this powder called No Ox. A friend of mine gave this to me. I have yet to try it, but apparently it is supposed to reverse the effects of oxidization. So maybe try that. Let me know how it goes. Additionally, if you are started down the path of oxidization and you have stopped it, you've halted it by putting some antioxidant sulfites in there, now's the time to make a port or a sherry style mead. You want to just add some honey, you want to fortify it with some whiskey or some brandy, and just see what happens. You might find yourself with a really nice kind of buttery, caramely, toffee, high ABV mead that you weren't planning on, but the oxidization has been halted and you've leaned into it with those port or sherry notes, turning it into something where that oxidized flavor, that little bit of oxidized flavor, is an asset rather than a detriment. Number 6, your balance is off. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you probably know I've got a whole video on balance called The Triforce of Balance, and I'll put a link to that in the description. I also have a video with my buddy Chef from the Discords who walks us through bench trialing to ensure that the balance is just right by using pre-measured dosages to dose acid, tannin, or sweetness so you can understand how they play and get your balance right before you start adding things to the carboy or bucket. And when the balance is off, it can be kind of hard to know what to do. And so sometimes it's best to bring in some friends, some wine or mead lover friends that can kind of ferret through those options with you and help you make a decision for where to go next. Bench trialing, like I said, is helpful, but your mead might just need more tannin or more acid or more sweetness to bring things into line. And again, I've got a whole video explaining how that works. And it might just need another ingredient to help kind of balance out what you already have. You might think about using some vanilla extract or some orange zest. Something simple might be all the difference you need to kind of tie that unbalanced mead together. A great example is my Acerglyn recipe. The Ace heavily relies on a small dosage of orange zest to bring everything together. In the end product, you don't really taste the orange, but when the orange zest isn't there, or when the orange zest is overdone, you notice it and it's a bad thing. You can also overdo spices. Too much cinnamon, too much clove, too much anise. All of those things can make for a very overpowering and kind of nasty mead if done the wrong way. And what do you do when you've overdone a spice? Blend, blend, blend. Blending the mead with another mead, especially if it's a very basic traditional wildflower or clover honey mead, just so you can dilute the spice concentration down, generally will get you somewhere you want to be. So you've got a gallon of overspiced clove mead, brew an entire gallon of clover honey traditional mead, let it finish, and then when racking, blend the two together by racking half of each into a clean carboy, and then racking the other half of each into another clean carboy. And that should help dilute it down so it's drinkable. Still too spicy? Do it again. Eventually, you'll get to something that you like, and you'll have a lot of mead left over. And number 7, you're feeling dejected and at a loss, and you just want to dump it out. Don't necessarily do this. Like I said in the previous points, a lot of meads can be saved. As I've mentioned many times in this video, blend it down and dilute it with something else to see if that improves the flavor. If there's even a spark of salvation in your mead, try blending it before dumping it. Now, you might be out the cost of a few more ingredients to do that second batch to blend it with, or you might just have a bottle laying around that you can rack from the bottle into your carboy and try that out. Either way, it's always worth some effort to play with additional flavors and dilution to see if you can achieve something that works. You could also transform it. You could just start going crazy with other flavors. Hit it with some big fruit. Hit it with some glycerin or maltodextrin to change the viscosity. Fortify it with brandy or amaretto or blue curacao. Anything to try and figure out a flavor profile that can salvage that mead, because you might find something really amazing on the other end of that journey. Sometimes with a mead that's just not working, if you can find a big, strong flavor and just lean into it, you can find your way to something that, even if it's not drinkable on its own, you can still use as a mixer with, sparkling water or soda in order to come up with a cocktail that works. And when in doubt, there's still alcohol inside that mead, right? So there are contingency plans. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please hit the subscribe button, ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future content from Doing the Most. If you'd like to join our community of super helpful folks, discord.doingthemost.org is where you go. Our Discord community is full of amazing home brewers who are at the ready to help you if you've got problems with your meads or wines or beers or ciders. So jump into our Discord server. I don't think you'll regret it. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all the members and patrons who support this channel. You'll see their names at the end of this video. If you'd like to become a member or patron, there's information in the description on how to do that. Until next time, happy brewing and cheers.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.